What's up, my wizards? It's Dev from Mtg. We like magic, and we're spending all week talking about competitive standard, finishing off at the end of the week when I give you the standard tier list. But today, we're going to go deep on a Dominaria legend that's getting a lot of press in Commander, but can we make it work in standard? Here's Sultai Muldrotha. Well, I'm using this whole week leading up to the standard tier list to highlight some decks that are on the fringes of standard and I think are better than people are giving them credit for, or I think it's the right time to play them for one reason or another. And this deck hits all of those notes, and I'm not the only one building it. There's a few people with confidence in this deck. A couple of weeks ago, Magic Pro player extraordinaire Corey Baumeister uploaded a list of Sultai Muldrotha onto TCG Player with a sideboard guide and everything. Pretty informative stuff. And then the deck showed up, or at least a list of the deck showed up on the MTGO Competitive League results, and there's a really long Reddit post on Spikes, the competitive Magic subreddit, about this deck where people are trying to get some things hammered out and try to get the numbers right and all that. But my list actually differs drastically from some of the stuff other players are doing, and there's definitely a couple of cards in here that will require some splaining, but we'll get to those when we get to them. I might as well go ahead and, as the wise men say, start at the beginning and let you know that we're playing 2 copies of Muldrotha. I think 2 copies is right here. She's a 6-drop, so you really don't want her in your opening hand, but she's kind of the whole reason to build the deck right now, so I want at least the 2 copies. But once Muldrotha's on the board, she is seriously the best value engine in all of Standard. Seriously, nothing in Standard grinds harder than Muldrotha. Once this card is out, it's almost impossible to lose a long game if they don't have a real answer to it. You know, not only is she awesome with all the creatures that we're playing in the deck, but we've got planeswalkers and even like spell lands that work really well with this. But that's just all the obvious, like, surface level stuff. There's a lot of dimensions to this. One thing you learn pretty quickly with Muldrotha is that she allows you to swing really freely with your creatures and not care if they die. A lot of our creatures are a little bit on the small, sort of fragile side, but they have really good enter the battlefield triggers. That means that we can run them in with Muldrotha. If they get blocked and die, doesn't matter. Just play them second main phase and repeat those crazy enter the battlefield triggers. Or our opponent can just not block them and take damage. That works for us too. One cool thing about Muldrotha, too, is that she doesn't have to attack to generate you value, which is very good in a format with Seal Away and Settle the Wreckage and stuff. Just about any creature that doesn't necessarily have to attack to get value is great against all the blue-white control decks once it's resolved. Muldrotha fits in that category, too. There's just a lot of good about this creature, and of course, against decks that don't play white, or if the white deck doesn't have any cards in its hand, feel free to swing for 6. Now, we're going to play 3 copies of Walking Ballista in this deck, yes, because it's in just about every standard deck, but it's especially good in this deck and is very often how you're going to win the game once the game goes long. You know, once you set up Muldrotha plus Walking Ballista, that's effectively game if you can get a couple of turns with that cycle, because you can just cast your Walking Ballista for whatever you want out of your graveyard if you got a Muldrotha out and just end up hitting them for 3, 4, sometimes 5 a turn, depending on how much mana you got. Aside from that, though, Walking Ballista is just a good, like, early game removal spell against Glintsleeve Siphoners and Elves and Bomat Couriers and all kinds of stuff. And it doesn't tax the mana base at all, which is really welcome in this 3-color mana base that's sometimes hard to make work. So a colorless, just catch-all, generically amazing card like Walking Ballista, already good enough to be in the deck. You know, we're looking for removal options. Yes, let's play Ballista, but also because of the fact that this is effectively how we're going to win, like, at least a third of our games. I'd say an easy 30% of our games are won by just repeat Ballista castings out of the graveyard. But we've definitely reached the first slot that's going to require some explanation on my part. Most people are going to play Glintsleeve Siphoner in this slot. Just about everyone I've seen build this deck tries to. But in my experience, it's kind of a huge liability against the red-based aggro decks. It sucks against Goblin Chain Whirler. It sucks against Fanatical Firebrand. It's just not great. We don't have a whole lot of other ways to generate energy in the deck. So sometimes the only way we have of getting energy is attacking with Glintsleeve. And that's just, it doesn't cut it often enough. But we still want an early game threat that Control has to care about and can block aggro's threats. So if Glintsleeve's out, we have some choices. Now, I've seen talk of a lot of different cards in this slot. The idea of Kitesail Freebooter has been passed around. I like that idea, don't get me wrong. But there's also Merfolk Branchwalker and even Miasmic Mummy, which looks neat but might be slightly cute. Don't get me wrong, a lot of people are singing the praises of Mummy though, so I might be way off base here. But what I ultimately ended up with was almost Merfolk Branchwalker. I ended up on 4 copies of Seeker's Squire instead. Now, with this, unlike Glensleeve Siphoner or even Merfolk Branchwalker, this always lives through a Goblin Chainwhirler or a Fanatical Firebrand, no matter what. And if it gets a +1/+1 counter, it can live through not only Shock, but Magma Spray, which is really important because that's a card this deck really hates. Also, if it gets the +1/+1 counter from exploring, it can block a lot of early aggro stuff and live. And you can't necessarily say that about Merfolk Branchwalker. Branchwalker trades with a lot, but doesn't necessarily live. This lives against far more in the early game than a Branchwalker would. So I like that aspect of it too. There's actually a lot to like about Seeker's Squire right now. Now we're also going to play 4 copies of Champion of Wits in the deck. Now, just like Glensleeve would be, this is bad against Chainwhirler, Firebrand, Walking Ballista, all that, but it's just too good for the deck to pass up. I want to play the full 4 copies of this because it not only draws us into the pieces we might need at any given time, but it also dumps cards into our graveyard. It's a milkshake, so we need that in this deck too. But we're also going to play 3 copies of Thrash Brantada, which is finding its way into a lot more main decks nowadays, because it just pulls double duty and nearly almost always finds a target. You know, against vehicles decks, this will kill Bomac Courier, importantly Heart of Kieran, and Scrap Heap Scrounger for a little while if you wanted to. All that's good. Kills Godfarer's Gift when you wanted to. That's also nice. Plenty of other artifacts you might want to deal with, but also kills enchantments like Seal Away, Cast Out, Ixalan's Binding. All that stuff is really, really pesky, you know, and it's in a lot of different decks nowadays. So it's good to be able to take that stuff out. And it can also kill History of Benalia and like other sagas and stuff if people are playing them. I've seen the Antiquities War around occasionally, so it just does so much right now. Again, it almost always finds a target no matter what you're playing against. It's got targets against control. It's got targets against the vehicles decks. It's just really solid right now in just about any deck that can support green, but especially in a deck that gets to play it over and over, it's amazing. Now here's another card that's probably going to require some splaining, but I'm going to play 2 copies of Banewhip Punisher here over Ravenous Chupacabra. First of all, it's not as mana intensive, and it doesn't cost as much as Chupacabra, so that's good, and it kills stuff like, you know, Bomac Courier and Elves and all kinds of other stuff, Glensleeve Siphoner, other Champion of Wits. There's plenty of stuff you can kill with the Bane Whip and keep your Punisher around. But unlike Chupacabra, this has the ability to put itself into the graveyard, which is really great in the Muldrotha deck, because you can just play it every single turn. Now we're playing a couple of 1-ups to finish off the creatures here, like the 1 copy of Gonti, Lord of Luxury, and we do have another copy in the board. To kind of back it up, I want this in specific matchups, but I'll put it in the main deck, at least the 1 copy, because it's good against just about everything. You know, against aggro, we can pick up a Lightning Strike, or sometimes even a Chainwhirler, which is really good against its own deck, and just play it. That tends to be really good against them, and it just brick walls aggro too. So that's good. Plus, against control, we can sometimes get a Teferi or a counterspell to cast later. That can be nice. Against midrange, we can grab a Karn. Just about anything. There's a lot of expensive cards people are playing right now. So we might as well just steal them and play them ourselves while we do that. Takes it away from them, gives it to us. Plus, this is great in a deck where we get to just play it over and over. You know, we can facilitate that by attacking aggressively with it or just brick walling them. You know, they're going to have to think twice about attacking with a Gonti on the battlefield, because if you've got a way to recur the Gonti and just repeat that enter the battlefield trigger, they're not going to attack with just about anything on the ground. They'll lose their guy to Gonti's Death Touch, and you'll get its enter the battlefield trigger. You get your Gonti right back. So Gonti's just terrifying in this deck in the right situation. But to finish off the creatures, just 1 copy of the Big Bug, the Scarab God. It's back. Haven't seen this in a while, dust it off, you know, but it's good in this deck, even in a world full of Seal Aways and Settle the Wreckage and other exile removal, because, mostly, I think that to facilitate this card nowadays, your deck has to be able to dump creatures into its own graveyard, which we do pretty well here, so I think we get away with a copy of the Scarab God, especially considering if we're not trying to get a Planeswalker or a land out of our graveyard, it's very often just better than Muldrotha. Now, one good thing about it in a world full of Seal Away and Settle the Wreckage and stuff is that it too doesn't have to attack to get value. I've said that about a couple of creatures in this video, but I do think that's really, really important for creatures in Standard. And the Scarab God is good at that. You never have to swing it sideways ever for it to be a serious problem for your opponent. Now, I'm also going to play 3 copies of Liliana, Death's Majesty. This is effectively a soft lock if you've got a Muldrotha and a Liliana out, and they don't have a Vraska's Contempt, we'll say. Because if they want to get rid of the Muldrotha, well, you can just get it back out of your graveyard with Liliana. If they want to get rid of the Liliana, you can just get it back out of your graveyard with the Muldrotha. So it feels soft locky, and it's really nice in the late game. Plus, Liliana is a way to sort of play Muldrotha ahead of schedule if you've been able to drop one into your graveyard. Now, to finish off the main deck, just a couple of cards that I think are absolute must-plays and are pretty obvious, so I'm going to fly through them, starting with the 3 copies of Charter Course. Now, I've seen some talk of playing strategic planning over this. You see more cards with strategic planning, but you get more fresh cards with Charter Course, and it's just a much more flexible card. You know, you have the ability later on in the game, or just about any time you can trigger Raid, to just draw the cards if you don't want to bin anything at that time. So I think the Charter Course is just the better card here, and I'm going to play 3 copies. But we're going to finish off the main deck here with just some removal. We're going to play 4 copies of Fatal Push and 3 copies of Vraska's Contempt. At first, I didn't know that 4 was the right number of Fatal Push, but honestly, again, these red-based aggro decks are just very, very bad matchups for us, in Game 1 especially, and I want as much help as we can get in Game 1 against those decks, so I'm going to play the full play set of Fatal Push, and we can take them out if we don't need them. We can side them out if we don't need them. It's totally fine. I think we grind well enough against control and mid-range that we have a much better Game 1 against them than we do any of these aggro decks, so I want the full complement of pushes from when we come up against those. As far as Vraska's Contempt, you're not seeing as many of these lately. I kind of think that's a mistake for a few reasons, you know. I've mentioned a few times in this video, and I'll say it at least one more time, that creatures that don't have to attack to generate value are getting more and more popular nowadays because of cards like Seal Away, Settle the Wreckage, and stuff. But Vraska's Contempt can take care of those. Plus, we obviously see all the Teferis, all the Karns, Chandra's still making plenty of appearances, and even other Planeswalkers, even though Karn and Teferi are obviously the big 2 right now. And Vraska's Contempt can take care of those. No fuss, no muss. So I want at least 3 copies of this, and I'm considering 4 pretty hardcore. This is also great, too, by the way, I don't have to mention, in the aggro matchups that we're so bad in Game 1, because it's going to kill their Hazoret and gain us 2 life back, and that's a really easy way to turn the corner. And here's the mana base right here. That's a lot of lands. There's 27 of them. I went with a control deck's mana base because we have got to hit our drops in this deck. And we're trying to play multiple 6 drops. There's even another 6 drop in the sideboard. So we really need to hit our drops in this deck. It's kind of imperative. Plus, we're trying to make this mana base work without Ether Hub. A lot of these decks, I've noticed, play Glintsleeve Siphoner and Servant of the Conduit and Ether Hub, but even with that setup, I didn't feel like it's enough energy to go around, and you want to use energy on all 3 of those cards. And again, you're really pinching pennies at the end of the day, so I didn't want the stress of making Ether Hub work, and even if you can try to make it work, it doesn't always work. So instead, I upped the mana, the land count by a land or 2 here, depending on what build you're looking at, and tried to make it as consistent as possible. I also wanted to play more spell lands than this deck usually plays. Even though we didn't find room for Field of Ruin, looks really good in this deck, Memorial to Unity and Ipni Rivulet are great. We lose a lot of games to a deck like Blue-White Approach, and a lot of Blue-White decks are playing Approach again now. Usually we can just grind out a game against Control, but if they've got Approach, that becomes a whole different ball game. But with Ipni Rivulet, we can just mill that, Approach off the top of their library. That's an important play. Plus, Memorial to Unity will help us find any creatures we haven't already found. So I think it's important to play that too. But in the end, just want to finish up on the mana base. There's a lot to talk about with this monster here. So just to finish up on the mana base, we ended up pretty consistent. We've got 16 green sources. That's mostly for hitting Thrashing Brantada as early as turn 4. I know we want it on turn 3, but we can't even activate it until turn 4. So that's what I've aimed at there. 16 green sources for that. We've got 16 black sources because a lot of our deck is black, and I want a lot of those. Plus, we've still made room for 15 blue sources in this thing so that we can get early Champion of Wits and Charter Course and stuff. But here's the sideboard, and this is actually far more self-explanatory than the mana base was. Duress is in there against control and combo decks like Godfarer's Gift. As far as control goes, though, We've also got Gonti Lord of Luxury, which will come in against them and the mid-range matchups, as well as Vraska Relic Seeker, which is another great card against mid-range. And in this deck, it's good in the control matchup, because if you can ever resolve a Muldrotha or resolve a Liliana to get the Muldrotha out of your graveyard, Vraska becomes a real option against control decks, because it's not just a situation where they counter it once, they never have to worry about it again. As long as you can get a Muldrotha out, you can replay Vraska over and over, and it becomes amazing against those decks, and obviously in the mid-range matchup, it's always good. I wanted this card in the main deck, honestly, but I felt like Gonti was the better choice in the main deck. I didn't want another 6-drop that we could open the game with, especially against aggro. We're already bad enough in that match. I don't want to run the risk of drawing another 6-drop in our opener. So this ended up in the sideboard, but it's very important in a lot of matchups. Negate is also in there against control and combo decks. Shouldn't have to tell you that, but pretty much everything else is against the aggro matchups. You see the Ether Meltdown? That's a standout card right there. And you could play Cast Down if you wanted to here. I like Cast Down against Steel Leaf Champion and Goblin Chain Whirler and a lot of stuff right now. But it turns out that Ether Meltdown works just about as well as a card like Cast Down does against those. Plus, it's a permanent, which means that if it ever goes to our graveyard, we can replay it with Muldrotha, which is a good thing to be able to do. So this is a holdover from when I was playing more energy cards in the deck, but it turns out it's still good. And do note that it has flash, which means that if you have a Muldrotha out, you can play it any old time you want, and that's nice to be able to do too. But there's another enchantment in there, and that's Argel's Bloodfast, which is great in a deck where it's really, really difficult to remove forever. If they somehow get rid of your Bloodfast with a cast out or something, you can just Thrashing Brantada that away. That's nice. Or if they get rid of your Bloodfast and put it into the graveyard somehow, like with a Naturalize or the Thrashing Brantada of their own, Muldrotha can bring back your Bloodfast. So this is a really good card against, obviously control decks of all stripes where we just want to draw cards and we don't care much about our life total. But we also have this cool thing we can do in our deck where we have, again, many, many ways of reanimating creatures. So once we get a Bloodfast flipped, we can just start sacrificing creatures to them and then replaying it the first, that same turn. That's nice. And finally, the Yahenni's Expertise there. I see a lot of people playing Golden Demise in this slot, which is understandable, but we can usually wait to get to Yahenni's Expertise, and this is way better against Goblin Chain Whirler, Golden Demise can't kill one. This absolutely can, and that makes a huge difference to me. Plus, we can always play a Champion of Wits or a Bane Whip Punisher or whatever off of our Yahenni's Expertise, which we can't do off of our Demise. So I think Yahenni's Expertise gets the nod, at least in my opinion. And here are those power rankings right here. A final score of 68. That is a very good score, even though we're bad in some categories. Obviously we're not the fastest deck in the world. In fact, Sultai's whole philosophy is to grind. And with cards like Muldrotha and Liliana and Scarab God and stuff, it's obvious that that is our whole thing, is grinding in this deck. So we make no pretense we're not a fast deck. But we make up for that by being good in just about every other category, especially resiliency, which is our all-star category here. And it is the king of the long game. No deck in Standard grinds like this deck. So once the game starts going long, you're just gonna win. We've got Muldrotha, we've got Liliana, we've got the Scarab God, we've got plenty of ways to get creatures back from our graveyard, not to mention the fact that Champion of Wits eternalizes. It's just, we are a nightmare for control decks. So if you're facing off against a lot of those, try this thing out. And if you are interested in doing so, the deck is expensive. I'm sorry about that. It's competitive week, but the deck is about $325 to build right now, which is at least less than the last deck I built, and less than a lot of the decks we'll cover during the standard tier list, because some standard decks are like $550 right now. But $325, not going to pretend like it's not any money, but at least it's less than what you could be spending. Let me just put it that way. And if you want to get it for even cheaper than that, you can if you do a little bit of digging on TCG Player. They're my sponsors. You probably know that by now. I say it like all the time, but they are where you can get this deck for the absolute cheapest online. If you dig a little bit, get some, lightly played or moderately played stuff, you be discerning with your vendors, you can get this for a little under $300 if you're into it right now, and it is a great deck if you're facing all the blue-white players. So give it a shot if you can. The deck is a whole lot of fun. And even if you don't want to order the deck, you might want to look at the deck list without having to watch me run my mouth for another 20 minutes. So just click the first link in the description. That'll take you right over to it on TCG Player. But aside from that, do all the YouTube stuff for me if you would, please. Like the video if you like the video. Sub if you're new. Hit the bell for the notifications, because apparently you got to do that nowadays. Follow me on Twitter at SBMTGDev, or throw me $1 a month on Patreon if you want to know what decks are coming 24 hours before we do them, or if you want to vote on what decks you want to do next. Patreon is how you're able to do that. So throw me $1 if you can swing it. Hope you can. Helps out more than you understand. I'm serious. Do all that, and I'll catch you cats later. I'm Deb from The Place. Thanks for watching, my wizards. Spread love and be kind.